Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today I'm doing Volume 2 of our first Fantastic Family of Marvel, Mr. Reed Richards himself. Now, this Smarty Pants may seem simple to paint, considering he's wearing an all-blue jumpsuit, but faces could be particularly tricky. But no worries, if we remember our basic fundamentals and exercise good brush control, we'll be able to pull off something amazing. Now, for this figure, we're going to be using a good amount of dry brushing, and a technique that I've touched on in previous videos, layering. Now, because I'm keeping this airbrush free, I'm going to need help from an extra piece of hardware, the wet palette. But don't worry if you don't have one, I'm going to show you how to make one with common household items. Now, I don't want to stretch this introduction any further than I have to. I'm going to head over to my painting table. Let's get started. As you can see, I've already primed Reed in flat black from Rust-Oleum. Since I want all the suits to match, I started basing the suit with a deep royal blue. Like all previous times base painting, you don't want to spend too much time doing this, so I use a heavy overbrush to apply it. This way, it's very fast and easy to spread a thin coat of blue over everything. The stiff bristles ensure that it's easy to get this in the deeper areas, and so long as you don't overload your brush, you won't have to deal with paint pooling in any areas. If you do happen to see some pooling, be mindful of it. Try to dab it up with your brush and spread it around before reloading. Once it was dry, I had a nice tint of dark blue over black as a foundation to build from. The first step up for this midtone is magic blue. Now at this point, we're going to have to start to control how much paint is on the brush, so be sure to check it each time you reload. Using a texture palette here will help give you an idea of how the paint is behaving. What you'll want to do is highlight each muscle separately, starting from the bulgiest spot, and then dry brush out towards the recesses. You'll need to repeat this for each major muscle group, and once you get to the smaller muscles like around his lats and lower back, it'll be easier to paint these as a group, but with a lighter stroke across them. It'll also help establish an above light source if you concentrate your strokes heading towards the feet. This way, a majority of the paint will end up on top of the muscle and fade to the darker shadows towards the bottom. Once all the muscles were painted with the midtone, it was already starting to take shape. Void Shield Blue stepped in to finish off the suit as a highlight. Once again, we're going to be dry brushing this on, but now it's even more important to control our paint. We want a very light dry brush. In practice, we want it to take 4 or 5 strokes before we even start to see a difference. Also, you'll want to pay attention to the grain of the fabric. We want the brush stroke to go perpendicular to this grain. That way, even in these highlighted areas, we'll still be able to see a bit of the royal blue deep in the seam, magic blue as the main color, and a dusting of void shield on top of the lip of every line. You'll have to pay attention because the angle of the grain changes from muscle to muscle, so be sure to take your time and visualize how you want this color to build up as you paint it. Once you have a clear picture in your head of what you want it to look like, be sure to hit the brakes when the model starts to look like that. With the highlight dry, the suit was done, and he was already looking pretty fantastic. Next, I grabbed matte black for the gloves and boots. I was a bit conflicted by this because by my memory, the boots, gloves, and collar of the uniform was always like a shiny rubber. But since this model has a bit of leather surface texture, I felt the matte finish would be better suited to represent the unstable molecule fabric. Perhaps I'll go back and put a gloss coat on them later, but for now, flat black is the plan. This is also a good time to black out his center emblem. Once dry, I grabbed uniform gray for the soles of his feet. There's not much to say about the step, mainly because you won't be seeing much of these feet in the final statue, so I laid down 2 solid coats, painted within the lines, and moved on for more interesting parts. Like the 4 logo, using the same gray and a stiff brush, I stippled in the first layer. It only took a few seconds to get a soft glow. I then switched to spaceship exterior for a touch more brightness. I also needed to swap over to a smaller stiff brush to keep this focused towards the center. If you run into any issues getting the inner area bright enough, you might try putting a small dab of gray in that center spot and then stippling to spread it out. Once the soft glow I was looking for was found, I used magic blue to fill in the 4 and the surrounding circle. You'll want to take your time and use the belly of your brush to restrict the paint to only the top surface. So long as you don't overload your brush, this should be fairly easy. If you do happen to overpaint here, a touch of black or light gray should help clean it up. With his body completed, this seemed like a good place to take a moment and thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Your continuous generosity keeps my noodle shelf well stocked, so thank you. And if any of you would like to make sure I'm not skipping lunch to keep the lights on, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. And if you like the content, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. The painting pantheon is inching towards 1,200 strong, and I can't wait to crack that milestone. But I can't get there without your help. So if you're not subbed yet, be sure to hit the sub button. And if you are already subbed, maybe think about hitting that like button so more people will know about this awesome channel. So if you could do that, that'd be sweet. Now, let's get back to Reed so we can push on through that finish line. In order to do skin tones, we're going to need several well-thinned colors at the ready. And for most cases, a regular palette like this would be fine. But over time, paints on this will dry out, which will be a no bueno. So we're going to be using a wet palette today. I picked this one up a few years ago for about 20 bucks. Don't worry if you don't have one. I'm going to show you how to make one for yourself using items you most likely have on hand already. You're going to need the following: a shallow dish or tray. In this case, I'm using the top of a Tupperware I no longer have, a few sheets of paper towels or toilet paper to act as a sponge, and finally, a bit of parchment paper. Be sure it's not wax paper, it won't work, so parchment only. So first you're going to fold and tear a few sheets of the paper towel to fit in the bottom of your dish. Then add enough water to completely soak the paper. Now, it's okay to have a bit of extra water pooling at the bottom, you just don't want this paper drowning in it. Finally, cut a piece of parchment so that it fits on top like so. I also like putting a couple of drops of water on top as well, just in case I want to thin a bit more. And congratulations, you now have your own wet palette. Now, since you most likely won't have a cover for it, any paint you use on it will only stay ready for use for about a few hours, but that should be more than enough. Now for the skin, I chose sanguine base and cobalt skin. I'm going to start by setting up a pool of each. Be sure to put a bit more of your lighter color because you'll need it. Now I like to set up 3 steps of mixing to be intermediate colors at roughly 25-75, 50-50, and 75-25. These aren't ratios that are set in stone, more like a guideline, so feel free to experiment to find what you like working with. But for now, let's get started on the skin. First, we should start with laying down our base layer of sanguine. Establishing this foundation gives us a nice reddish shadow tone, which works very well for the average Caucasian skin. If you're painting skin that's going to be on the fairer side, you may want to swap out the sanguine for more of a pink or even a deep orange. After a few moments to dry, our face was ready for the next color. Here's a good time to let you know this is going to be one of those trust the process kind of things, meaning it's going to look bad. I mean, really bad. And in fact, it might seemingly get worse as we go along. And really, it's only going to come together when you're nearly done. So if you find yourself discouraged by your results, try your best to just power through, and you might be surprised. With that said, with this color, you're going to be looking to cover about 95% of the skin, only leaving the base red in the deepest details, like the inside corners of his eyes, the sneer lines from his nose that bracket his mouth, and deep in his ears. And thankfully, using a wet palette will keep your paints nice and thin enough that it should take at least 2 coats to get a decent coverage. After 2-ish coats, Mr. Richards is starting to show up. Moving on to our middle tone, it's time to start restricting where we paint even more. Just like with dry brushing, it's a good idea to always start with the most highlighted areas and blend towards the dark. So I started with his nose and cheekbones, and then outline his jaw and chin, and finally his forehead. While I do end up covering about 80% of the face, doing these areas first will result in a high opacity in those spots, creating a softer highlight. The most important thing in this step is to not paint in the shadows we're preserving. Given some time to dry, he was getting into that vampire stage. No reason to slow down, on to color 4. Just like the last step, I started in the areas I wanted the most opacity: forehead, nose, cheekbones, chin, and then blended in with thin layers towards the shadow. This kind of brings me to my issue with this sculpt though. This doesn't really look like Reed Richards. He's got a bit of a large pointy nose and a weird beak-like thing happening with his mouth. Honestly, if you ignore the hair, he looks more like the Spider-Man villain, the Vulture. I don't know, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Aesthetic choices aside, another issue you should be aware of is this weird artifact I found in the keyed slot that would attach the head to the body. It wasn't a print error because when I checked the STL, sure enough, it was there too. Thankfully, I was able to drill this out after printing, but you should be aware of this defect if you decide to try this build. Once dried, I held off on doing the final highlights for now. 1, because you really need to give time for all the layers to fully cure. The colors will blend more once they're fully dry, and I can make informed decisions for the final highlight. And second, I wanted to get the other facial details painted so I have a better idea what it was gonna look like. While the skin cured, I blocked in the eyes with ash gray and highlighted the center with spaceship exterior. Once the eyes were in, I came in with my lightest skin tone to fill in the slight puffiness between each eye. Skipping this step may make the face look like it's wearing deep mascara. Now for the eyes, again using iris decals from Evolution X that I picked up on Etsy. Once I sized up a pair of brown eyes and cut them out, I trimmed off the top 15% because Reed's eyes are slightly closed. Using my brush flooded with water, I maneuvered them in place with the trimmed edge along the top eyelid. I did this so that he would appear to be looking straight ahead or slightly up. Once I was happy with the placement, I sealed it down with a bit of decal fix. Next, it made sense to work on his teeth with a quick base of skeletal bone. Here, I painted very carefully, as it would be difficult to do any kind of touch-ups in this area. So go as slow as you please and paint clean. And do your best to reserve the sanguine blood that we painted earlier for his gums. Next, I jumped over to his hair and based it with oak brown. While this is a very straightforward step, it's very important to paint clean. So when painting the hairline around the face, be sure to not have too much paint on your brush, and make sure your brush strokes move away from the face. It's a lot easier to control the paint this way. But even then, you'll need to take care as the texture lines of the hair will want to wick the paint from your brush. If you do make a mistake, like I did here, you have a chance to fix it if you move fast. First, wash out and dry your brush. Then, from the face side, run the tip of the brush over the paint. This will start to suck it up like a mop. Then clean the brush and go back over the area with a light scrubbing motion, only using the tip of the brush. Hopefully, you'll be able to save your piece. If overpainting is an issue you deal with regularly, I would suggest you sealing your work often with a varnish. It acts sort of like a save file, because you can scrub paint off the top of it pretty easy while it protects the layers underneath. Just remember, this can only do so much. I loaded up a rich leather to highlight the hair. And we're going back to my favorite technique, dry brushing. And like the final highlight of the suit, we'll want this to be so light that it takes 5 or 6 strokes before you notice any change. And also, like before, we're going to focus the strokes to be perpendicular to the grain of the hair. If you're focused, this should only take a few minutes to get even highlighting. Now that the teeth had plenty of time to dry, they got a quick coat of light shade just to separate the individual teeth. With the mouth getting close to done, it seemed like a good place to finish off the bottom lip. Using the middle shade of skin tones here is a solid choice, as in most cases a person's bottom lip should be slightly darker than their main skin tone. There is a little bit of wiggle room on this, so feel free to experiment. To finalize the teeth, I mixed in a bit of white with my bone color and dabbed it on each tooth. I did not bother trying to get them all pearly. While I usually give my heroes perfect teeth, I'm making a bit of an exception here, mainly because doing detail work in here is risking overpainting, and also I imagine Reed has pulled a lot of coffee all-nighters. Next to paint are his iconic gray winglets. Starting with a base of uniform, it's a good thing to keep in mind during this step that gray starts at the root. So that's where you should start painting these. Otherwise, you could end up with some really odd looking gray hair. So unless you're going for that odd look, this is some advice you should heed. Then I highlighted it with Spaceship Exterior using my tiniest dry brush. Just remember, like the previous dry brushing, super light, super controlled. If there is any overpainting onto the brown hair, it can be easily cleaned up with a dab of oak brown. Once I let everything dry, everything got clear coated and glued up. And Mr. Fantastic is done. Now, despite how I feel about the face, I think the paint job came out pretty darn good. And he looks even better with Ben standing right by. What do you guys all think? Does it look good? Do you think he looks like Reed Richards, the Vulture, or Bela Lugosi as Dracula? I don't know. Could be any of those. Like I said earlier, I can't unsee it anymore. But thankfully, he's in the back, and so far it fits in perfectly with Ben. But that's gonna wrap this video up. 2 family members down, and 2 to go. Which one would you all like to see next? Sue or her brother Johnny? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. I'm pretty excited for the effects I want to try. Hopefully you all come back next week to enjoy it as well. Until then, as always, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.